Hello, and welcome to Games as Lit 101. Romance is totally for chicks, right? Perhaps more than any previous media, movies have done a lot to convince us that romance stories are the sole domain of women. We literally have an entire genre we refer to as the chick flick, and even romance movies that don't fall into that same formula often get lumped in with them. To be fair, there are a lot of cheap romantic comedies every year that pander to the stereotypical romantic desires of women, but it's resulted in this false idea that men can't also connect with romantic stories. Many classic works of fiction that plenty of men appreciate are romantic in nature, and every guy even has at least one chick flick they don't totally hate, which is usually code for actually really liking it, but not wanting to lose their man card. I could do a whole episode on the toxicity of a culture that's so fixated on the fulfillment of these gender stereotypes, but that's another topic for another time. In Western culture, the idea of a romance story that's made specifically with men in mind seems kind of weird, and maybe even nothing short of ridiculous. But it does exist, surprisingly, in video games. And perhaps less surprisingly, specifically in Japan. The visual novel genre is an interesting one. It's basically a book with pictures, music, and maybe some level of animation. Most visual novels allow the player to make choices that take the story in different directions, and since writing more content is relatively easy compared to all the work that has to go into branching storylines in more technologically complex games, these games can actually have immense amounts of story on multiple paths. So it's not too surprising that the genre has become home to a number of romantic games, usually involving a protagonist and multiple supporting characters of the opposite sex that, depending on the player's actions, can become romantically involved with the protagonist. But interestingly enough, the protagonists of these games are usually male, and as that fact implies, so is the target audience. And this extends into a number of beloved anime based on these kinds of games as well. So here we have kind of a unique situation, at least in Western eyes. Let's take a look at the narrative elements of these romance stories that are used to appeal to male sensibilities. Now let's just get this one thing out of the way real quick first. There are a number of these games that include graphic sexual content, so it would be really easy to just pass this whole thing off, that's what the dudes are here for, obviously. But not only is this not a universal element of the genre, but many games that include such content also require anywhere from 4 to 20 or even 30 hours of reading to get there. So I think it's more than a little unfair to actually pass the whole genre off as nothing more than pornography. More often than not, romance is the defining element of these games. This isn't particularly gender-specific, but one thing that certainly helps is the fact that all these games tend to have multiple characters the protagonist can romance. Not all at once, but rather, the player makes a series of choices that define which of the girls he shows interest in, and after a certain point, the game goes forward with a unique romance story for that particular girl. The film genre we quite unlovingly refer to as the chick flick tends to play to a few specific types of romantic leads. He's sensitive, he's caring, he has a good sense of humor, and if none of this seems true of him at first, it's only because he hides his tender soul behind toughness to compensate for some kind of dark past. Deviations from this are pretty rare for the genre, or at least they were before Twilight came along and repopularized the straight-up insufferable douchebag archetype. But with the ability to change the story often comes the ability to choose which character you're interested in. We all have a type, if you will, the kind of character that we connect with more easily than most others, and many of these visual novels allow you to use your choices to gravitate towards the character that you're most attracted to. This concept goes hand in hand with the inclusion of the projection protagonist, which most of these games do include. Now, I've talked about this in detail before, but the basic idea of the projection protagonist is that the main character is designed with very few defining characteristics, so the player can then project their own personality, or whatever personality they choose, onto the main character. But the true key to these male-oriented romance stories, I believe, is what these characteristics are and how they affect the story. While it's not a great idea to perpetuate gender stereotypes, there are certain themes and ideas that tend to appeal more to one gender or the other, and artistic industries like film, literature, music, and video games have capitalized on that in a big way. So any conversation about a work's target audience will work off these ideas, even if they can be kind of sexist sometimes. So then, naturally, a romance targeted at men will appeal to the stereotypical sensibilities of men. And weirdly enough, that's all it takes. You don't need to somehow make the romance about shooting dudes or make it all about sex instead of love. You just need to appeal to some thematic elements that men will connect with. Clannad, for example, plays heavily with themes of fatherhood and responsibility. The protagonist's major defining characteristic is a desire to help people, and especially once the game goes past high school into adulthood, his goal is to provide a good life for the woman he loves, and this desire to protect and provide for his beloved is central to his later development. It also helps that the major canonical romance in that game is a girl who approves of him despite his flaws, and respects and supports him in everything he does. And the resulting story actually does usually connect with men more than women. In Steins Gate, the protagonist is driven by ambition and the need to make his mark on the world, until it all comes crashing down and he needs to focus on protecting those close to him. For that matter, the major romance in this game is someone who challenges him in a way that helps push him to new heights. They clash often, but their differences are a major element of accomplishing his goals, not just of the romance itself. Catherine isn't a visual novel, but it's a romantic supernatural thriller about the struggle between freedom and stability. Vincent is just a normal guy who's dealing with commitment issues, and the choices of the player will determine whether he maintains a stable, long-term relationship with his girlfriend, or abandons her for a free-spirited life of worry-free frivolity. A good portion of the game's playtime is even spent hanging out and talking with Vincent's guy friends about their relationships, and it presents a good deal of issues men seem to face when trying to connect with the opposite sex. You'll notice there's still some room here for variety, which is good considering you need a varied cast of characters for the whole choose who you romance thing. There are a number of different ways to appeal to men, even within the narrow stereotypes media tends to target, and a good, large, varied cast of characters that each bring out different things in the protagonist is a really good way to appeal to all different sorts of players. Honestly, I feel like it's kind of weird that I even need to talk about this, but it's so ingrained in our culture that romance stories are for women, and men not only don't, but in some cases can't or aren't allowed to like them, that seeing the way that these stories use romance to speak to men specifically is kind of weird. Even if ultimately there's absolutely no reason why a man can't enjoy a good romance story. So if you ever play one of these, or even just watch the anime based on them, keep an eye out for the way the romance is structured to empathize with the male perspective. It's really cool to see how they take something that we normally think of as, for lack of a more mature word, girly, and use it to appeal to men instead. So whatever you think about this whole thing, go ahead and talk about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Also check out Games as Literature on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon if you'd like. Links for all those are down in the description. Next week, we talk about Super Smash Bros. And how one of the games has a story mode that might actually be the best story Nintendo's ever done. So, until then, class dismissed.